All righty. Well, it's good to finally meet you. Yeah, Atlas Power Shrugged. I did a podcast with him, and he shared some of your content with me, and then I was like, wow, this guy's doing some crazy stuff. A lot of the what I've really been interested in lately, or I guess the last 6 months, is the whole like spinal flexion debate, and like and just moving your spine through different ranges of motion, and not fear mongering certain movements.
Right.
And I guess what I'll ask you first is what's your training background, and how did that lead into what you're doing today?
Sure. So, in my earliest days of training, I started lifting weights when I was like 14 in high school because I was just a little skinny kid and I wanted to get stronger, and I was very unathletic, like a little, pot smoking skateboarder. And I started to realize like I just wasn't, just not good at athletic stuff. So I started lifting weights. I continued with that for a long time, like through school. I was a co-ed cheerleader in college, of all random things. So I got really into Olympic weightlifting from the stunting side, where you're throwing people in the air and trying to catch them. So we did a lot of like classic powerlifting stuff and Olympic weightlifting. And through that, I kind of got into CrossFit, and I competed in CrossFit. My wife and I owned a CrossFit gym in Denver for a few years, and we sold the gym. We moved to California to go coach at, I don't know if you're familiar with Rob Wolf, but we coached at Rob Wolf's old gym called NorCal Strength Conditioning. And that was kind of where we started to move away from CrossFit. They had moved away from CrossFit. They still had a similar model, but it was just scaled back a lot, like lowering the intensity, getting people in an on-ramp program, so you're not just throwing new people into the gym, into CrossFit classes. And we got a little more into the Olympic weightlifting side. So I got into that, and that was about 10 years ago almost that we moved to California. And about that point, I just started to I was training a lot. I was 29, and feeling kind of like shit, like doing all the stuff where I had felt really good for a long time, getting stronger, making progress, but my back started to bug me more and more. My left shoulder hurt a lot. And that kind of, through dealing with lots of aches and pains, and really it got to the point where like I just had to stop working out because I would throw my back out, have violent back spasms, like bending over to tie my shoe. We had found something called functional range conditioning, and I had no idea what that stuff was. I just saw some of their instructors doing some really crazy looking stuff that looked really interesting, like spine movement and lots of hanging shoulder movement stuff where, just a couple things that I saw, I was like, well, that's weird. They're like, look what they're able to do. Like, those are things that in my head I would say, that's bad for your shoulders, that's bad for your back, don't do that. We must maintain a neutral spine, and don't hang on something and twist around while you're hanging on it. I didn't know. And so I kind of went down that rabbit hole with a friend of mine, trying to see what that stuff was about. And it was really, really intriguing. So we went to a functional range conditioning certification, and kind of had that, classic blue pill, red pill moment of like, holy shit, everything that I've been doing there's something that's really different and totally the opposite of that. And things that I've been afraid of and avoiding for a long time are actually things that are normal human functions. And you can train those things to be really strong. And that really just led me down the rabbit hole of like expanding range of motion and training spine flexion. And really what I look at now is like, I'm just trying to train all of that stuff that everybody says is really bad for you, because if your body can move there's a chance you can probably prepare it to do that. That's not saying that you just need to go try to do a 225-pound Jefferson curl, of course, but you can train your spine to be strong in all those positions, and your shoulders, and everything.
Yeah, that's one thing. If you think about it intuitively, and you think like, if the spine wasn't able to flex, or if it's dangerous to flex the spine, why does it flex? You know what I'm saying? Like, if you just sit back, and think about it, you're like, why have we demonized certain movements that our spine can move? It's like, no one's going to tell you, you're going to hurt your back if you pick up a pencil, if you flex your back, or, but maybe
we do.
Yeah.
That's like, get hurt doing it and pick up things, it's.
Yeah. So that's interesting. That's one thing. I'll tell you a little bit about my training history. I did actually start with CrossFit. I never took it, like, I never did it like in a competitive sense. Just I was interested in CrossFit because it was cool that they blended a lot of different training modalities.
Yeah.
And so I did a lot of that kind of stuff. Right now, I would say I'm like mostly hypertrophy training, mostly in the bodybuilding world.
Cool.
But I did do a lot of CrossFit stuff, and I kind of banged myself up a little bit doing that. Like I can't say like it was the CrossFit that hurt me, but I had a lot of back issues. I'm 29.
Okay.
But in my early 20s and mid 20s, I had like some debilitating back pain for a while there. For like 3 years, I thought I was pretty depressed for a while. Like my back was really fucked up, and I thought, oh, this is my life now. And it kind of
Dude,
made me
I
have
feel
to
you.
it kind of made me have to reassess my training.
Yeah,
And right now I'm feeling amazing. My back feels great.
it's great.
And one of the main things that I did to fix it is stop fearing movement. Number one, stop,
Sure.
because I babied my back because I was, oh, my back's fucked up, I can't flex. But now it's, I'm doing heavier lifting, and I'm really trying to strengthen my spine through these
Nice.
different kind of movements. I still have a little bit of I see you doing like the Zercher deadlifts and stuff like that. And that's something I'm trying to work my way into. And I'm just doing like,
Nice.
right now I'm doing Jefferson curls with very light weight. There's still like a fear in my head of like, oh, I don't want to go too crazy heavy, but I'm kind of curious. Like
Yeah.
when you first started doing these, flexion movements,
Mhm.
how do you like progress into doing, you just did like a 400 and some pound Zercher deadlift the other day. I'm like, holy
Yeah.
shit. What,
It's
what
come a long way, man, from bending over and hurting myself with no weight to being able to do that. Yeah, so I mean that's a really good question, and that's something I get a lot of questions on pretty regularly on Instagram. Like, people are like, my back feels like shit when I round it. So how do you progress to loading it? And it's always a little bit different depending on what's going on. But, generally we want to assess the spine movement first. That's a big part of functional range conditioning, is just looking at like everybody's spine moves a little bit differently. Everybody's going to be able to tolerate different ways to load their spine. So you look at how well does your spine just make the shape of flexion and extension. So kind of the unicorn spine that we want, that doesn't exist because we all have injuries, we all have different ways that we've moved leading up to this current point in our life. Ideally, what we have is every vertebrae has a little bit of flexion and extension, and we have control over that at the individual vertebrae level. That doesn't mean like I'm just going to move this vertebrae here while I'm sitting here. It doesn't quite work like that. But say when we're moving from like something like a cat cow into flexion and extension, we're trying to segmentally control it, just meaning that maybe we're starting at the lumbar spine and we're moving that particular part of the spine into extension and then moving through the thoracic spine and then the cervical spine, as opposed to just globally moving it into flexion or extension. So we want control over it at that level, and then looking at areas that have more or less movement, because everybody's in that camp. Like if you see somebody flex their spine, you might see a really nice curve in their thoracic spine, and then maybe as they go down in their lumbar spine, it starts to flatten out. So you can just say you have less lumbar flexion. So maybe loading that end range of your lumbar flexion is going to be problematic potentially, because generally all over, like the further we get into our end ranges of movement, the less ability we have to generate and absorb force. I mean, you've done bicep curls, you know that here is a lot harder to do work as it is with my elbows straight. Mid-range always feels the strongest. We kind of have this bell curve of force development and absorption. So with a spine, if I have really limited lumbar flexion, it doesn't move a lot. It just means that it takes a really small amount of movement for me to get into that range where that tissue just doesn't do a lot of work, which is usually why people start to have problems with their low back. Like if your low back flexes that much, if you're trying to pick something up and you're in that end range of movement, you've never trained that to be strong. It's easy to overload that tissue. So, generally with the approach of functional range conditioning, we're starting at like, let's see what your baseline is. Let's find these areas that don't move as much. And then let's start some focused training on getting those areas to move more. And that takes a combination of passive stretching, like if that tissue is just tight and doesn't move there, the only way that we're going to get into a new range to be able to load that tissue there is to stretch it. So over time, we get it to move a little bit more, and then we can start with things like low-level isometrics, training that tissue. And I think that the hardest part about spine training is that since you have all of these individual chunks that can move, there is a way that it sort of self-organizes the way that it loads. Like it just puts load into the areas that move more, and the areas that don't move as much are a lot harder to get up to the same level of movement as the areas that move more, because it's just going to load the stuff that moves better, because that's one important component of moving and loading is that tissue just moves. That's how your spine distributes load. So sometimes it takes more than just say a Jefferson curl, because in a Jefferson curl, I am trying to move my spine, curling it down and curling it back up. But for people who have really limited lumbar flexion, sometimes it's hard to really get that stuff to move more. There's ways that you can target it more specifically. Like, I love Jefferson curls. I think they're a really good tool to use. But sometimes we're better off getting a little more focused work specifically on the lumbar spine. And you can kind of, pair these things together. Like, this is a general example, but stretching the lumbar spine to get it into, like, targeting the area where you can feel some tension in your spine erectors there. And then maybe doing some isometric movement on it. We're trying to just isometrically load those lumbar erectors in their lengthened position. And then practicing some movement where, say, maybe we are just trying to go through flexion and extension, but instead of moving your whole spine, we're trying to target just through the lumbar spine. And we're accumulating reps of movement where we can help our nervous system understand now that it has access to a little bit more tissue to move. And then maybe pairing it with something like a really lightly loaded Jefferson curl, where now we're trying to integrate that chunk of your spine with the rest of it so we can make sure that all of it's moving. That's a really good approach to where we can be a little bit more specific, because sometimes people they do Jefferson curls, but they end up, their lumbar spine doesn't move a lot, so they're not getting enough load to create that adaptation. And that's really what it's all about, is getting enough loading on the tissue that we need to move more so it adapts and moves more. It's very much the same principles that we use to strengthen any part of the body. In this case, we can be really specific with where we target that stuff, as opposed to just generally moving the whole spine or whatever part we're talking about.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind for me is just, say you're someone like me, you're very focused into bodybuilding and strength training.
Sure.
And how do you integrate this stuff that you work on in a way that, you're not in the gym for 7 hours every day?
Another great question. Yeah. That's a tricky one, just in the sense of, there's really so many options. I think a lot of it is coming up with what's going to work best for you. Like, what I used to do was I would go do my strength work, and then I would try to find other time to do passive stretching if I needed to do it. Although there was a period in my life where I didn't do any passive stretching at all, and I just got super tight and really hard to move. And then I started, when we got into functional range conditioning, we were trying to integrate it in the same session. Like, so we were doing components of joint specific training along with global classic stuff. Maybe we're working on some hip rotation stuff on a day that we do squats, and kind of doing it like as classic supersets. Most recently, since November, we've started incorporating FRC. They came up with a new model for training strength. It's called the internal strength model. So it's very much focused on training the individual components of any movement, and looking at, like, what's a healthy hip supposed to do? Let's train those functions of the hip, because that's just going to get you to generate more force through more range of motion. That's going to translate really well to anything that you want to do with your hip, including squatting. So currently in my sessions, the way that I'm putting it all together is, I'm starting with, say it's a hip day, I'm starting with hip capsule space. So in that case, I'm looking at internal and external rotation of my hip. I'm training those ranges to be stronger. For a while, I was training to get more, because I had a lot of back problems that were very associated with just having a hip that barely moved at all. So when I would do hip stuff, I would have to load my back way more than it was tolerant of. So, training to develop more hip rotation, I do that as part of it. And then you sort of work your way out. We're starting at that really deep tissue of the hip that makes up the hip capsule and the tissue that rotates the femur. And we're sort of working our way out to the more superficial stuff. And so currently I do it all in one session, but part of the internal strength model that's a lot different than traditional training is that we only have so much energy available to train, to dedicate to recovering from our training efforts, right? And traditionally what we're putting in most of our intensity in is the muscular tissue. We do sets and reps of squats, bench press, whatever that is. That creates lots of muscle damage, which of course it takes some component of that to adapt to it and get stronger at benching or squatting. But we're leaving out important components that make up that whole system that allow you to bench and squat, like your connective tissue load bearing tolerance, your joint capsule space. How much can that joint just move on its own? Because that's going to dictate how much we can load that joint through X amount of range of motion. And also how your nervous system understands, where that joint is in space, how well it moves, all of those control components. So the idea of the internal strength model is that in a session, we're trying to put in work into each one of those components And based on the thing that we need the most of, we're putting the intensity on that one thing. And then the rest of the stuff is kind of maintenance mode. But what that does is it allows us to get adaptation on the one thing that we need the most of. But then it's also just kind of pushing the needle forward on all those other pieces. Like if you want really strong muscles, well, you definitely want to make sure that your connective tissue has enough load bearing tolerance that it can handle that level of contraction, right? So we're not either losing force when it's contracting, or we're not just going to get injured because the connective tissue can't tolerate that level of force. I want to make sure that, I want to make sure my hip can actually go in that position and I have strength in that position. So that's how I organize it currently. It's all just in my head now. It's all training, where prior to that, I used to really separate that stuff out. I was like, this is my strength work, this is my flexibility and mobility work. And for some reason, those are all separate. Now I look at it as it's all training, and it's all moving me towards those goals. And my goals are, doing like feats of strength stuff. What I will say about this, a couple components that are a lot different. Like I'm used to doing high volume strength work, muscle work, getting sore and beat up. And this, when we get to the muscular component, we're trying to do the goal is to do like the bare minimum to elicit an adaptation. So instead of doing 5 sets of squats, I might do 60 seconds of squats. And if I'm putting the intensity on the muscular component, I'm trying to take that to momentary and voluntary failure. Because failure, or hitting that level of intensity, has an endocrine response that just tells your brain, like, build more tissue here. And if I can do that in 60 seconds of reps versus doing 5 sets of 10, that just leaves a little more energy available to go to those other components, my connective tissue, all the other things that I was doing in that workout, as opposed to, say if I did 5 sets of 10 squats, maybe that last 2 reps of my 5th set, I hit a really high intensity where I almost hit failure, or maybe I hit failure there. Well, if it took me 50 reps to get there, I'm causing a lot more muscle damage that has to be recovered from, as opposed to whatever that amount that I could have hit just to hit the adaptation button, so one part of this for me has really been learning how to push the intensity side of it versus like what I thought was intense. Because what I realized when I was trying to first go to muscular failure was like, what I thought was intense was me just being uncomfortable and stopping. Like, this sucks, I don't want to do it anymore. Actually going to the point where you're just trying to stand up in a squat and you're moving down, even though you're trying as hard as you can to stand up, that's a major skill that you have to learn that takes a lot of practice. Because I spent months failing to fail in the desired time. But I'm going all over the place. But what I was trying to work towards saying all this stuff is that it's been really interesting doing this stuff, because, what my ego wants me to do versus what I'm actually doing is there's definitely a discrepancy there. It's like my brain's like, do another set of deadlifts, do another set of squats. You only did 1, but it's been really wonderful to make strength progress, feel way less beat up between my sessions because I'm just doing less volume overall, and still like move those needles forward on getting more external rotation in my shoulders. Really having those parts feel better. Like there's been no point in my training life where I've been able to really feel like I'm improving the way that my joints move and feel. I'm making strength progress and I'm not beat up. Like every time I've tried to make progress, there's always some setbacks there. Like I threw my back out or whatever that is. It's like, this is the only way that I've trained where I just feel good and I'm making progress. And at 39 now, it's definitely 29 is about when all that stuff started to change for the other direction, where I was like, man, all this stuff that worked great really feels like shit now. What's going on? Like I didn't get hurt. I didn't, nothing's changed. I'm just doing the same stuff. But it's been cool to experiment with all this stuff.
Yeah, there's a few things I want to get into. Number one is, let's just say, going into these things, but to save time, like, would you say to some people, if your knees aren't bugging you, maybe you don't need to work on any of these, different knee movements or stuff like that. Like maybe you can just target certain things. Like if your back feels like shit. So we'll get into that. But I also,
cool.
I'll tell you my story a little bit. Is when I was having my back pain issues, I would get into like mobility drills and stuff like that, but I never found that any of it helped, because I feel like there's a lot of people out there that are sharing these, quote unquote correctional movements or mobility stuff. And there's a lot of, I don't know, there's a little bit of snake oil out there. And
there's a lot of snake oil out there.
Yeah. So I'm a little bit, I guess you could say jaded in that regard. And now, like, I don't do any mobility work. I don't do any stretching. I just do, bodybuilding, controlled movements, full range of motion. And what would you say to the people that would, maybe not address anybody, like I'm not saying address anyone in particular, but
Yeah, cut these people out.
yeah, just people that will say, or even just say like mobility drills aren't really necessary. All you need to do is just work movements through a full range of motion. Or they'll say, some of these science-based, I'm not thinking of one name in particular, but I'm not going to bring them up. We'll say, stretching is completely useless. Don't stretch.
Yeah.
You're already stretching just by, stretching the muscle when you're doing hypertrophy training or strength training or whatever. Let's use like RDLs as an example of stretching your hamstrings. Or why do you need to do static stretching on top of that? Those are all things that I think about, and I don't really know. So
yeah, totally. I mean, I really appreciate those questions, because I felt the same way for a really long time. Like, what's the point? And there's seemingly legitimate studies out there that say, you don't need to passively stretch. You don't need to do any mobility exercises. Train with full range of motion, do varied activities, and you'll get better. And, the problem with that, there should be a big asterisk there, is that, that could be true depending on how you do that. But, I always just use the example of, like, in functional range conditioning, we do stuff called CARS, which is just a fancy acronym, controlled articular rotation. That's just saying, I'm going to take this one joint, I'm going to move it in isolation, I'm going to move it through its full range of motion. And there's a lot of people who are like, that's a waste of time. You don't need to do that, because if you're benching, you're doing pull-ups, you're doing all these different exercises, you're getting a varied range of motion on your shoulder. However, it's like what you mentioned about your knees. Say you don't have any knee problems. Why do I need to do these knee exercises? I mean, our bodies are pretty much 24 hours a day are trying to prioritize the maintenance of tissue based on how it gets used. And a lot of the stuff that we do, so we look at a shoulder joint, like to do pull-ups, to do bench press, to do dips, that requires lots of those parts of your shoulder that are working. And the way that we assess a working shoulder is like, is there space for this bone to move around free of the rest of this stuff moving? Can I put my arm in all these positions, and can I internally and externally rotate it? Rotation is kind of the marker of joint space and how well that joint moves, because if you have adequate rotation, that's really just what allows that bone to move in all these other places and allows that tissue to work like it's supposed to around the rotator cuff. Now, my shoulder has all of this movement here. I mean, that's the full expression of what my shoulder can do. I'm basically trying to externally rotate my shoulder joint through adduction, flexion. I'm trying to bring it out here, internally rotating. That's the full range of motion of what my shoulder does. And the longer I go without challenging all those ranges of motion, because when I put that arm in all those positions, that's targeting different tissue than what I'm going to get doing bench press, pull-ups, and other stuff like that. What ends up happening over a long enough time scale is that my brain is basically prioritizing its ability to do some of this, and all that other stuff slowly starts to go away. And over time, that often causes problems, just because that system of the shoulder joint rotating and being able to generate force in all of those positions is really what makes it better at doing all of any shoulder exercise. It doesn't matter what exercise it is. It's the ingredients that I need for that joint to move and be loaded in all those positions. And if you start to lose parts of those just because we're not doing it enough, at some point you're going to start to have problems with that. That's really the incentive for doing the stuff. Even if it's working like it's supposed to, we want to maintain those qualities. Like, there's no point in your life where you would really say, you know what, I don't need my shoulder to go here. I don't really need it to go here. I only do these things. You really want as much shoulder joint as you can get. So a component of this stuff is just maintaining the qualities that we have, because, I mean, anybody who's worked out long enough knows at some point in your life, if you continue to work out, usually things start to feel bad. Like, why did I bench for 20 years, make progress on my bench press, and then seemingly out of the blue, my shoulder started to bug me when I'm bench pressing. Like, I've been bench pressing this whole time. Everything's been fine. In my case, I just didn't have very much internal rotation. The longer you go without using that end range of internal rotation, the more likely you're going to be that you slowly start to lose a little bit of it. And it's interesting because a small loss in range of motion in, say, internal and external rotation can have a big impact on how your shoulder moves and feels. So that's really why it's valuable to do this, even if everything's working, because if you want to keep doing that stuff, you want to maintain those qualities. And since your body's constantly prioritizing that stuff, that's a big component of what we all associate with aging. You know, it's like, why does everybody's back get stiff as they age? It's not, I mean, is that just because that's what happens? No, it's because there was a long enough period of time that we didn't challenge that tissue enough that your brain was like, you need to have more spine flexion. I'll maintain that for you because you're using it. It just slowly lets that stuff fade away because it's not being used. Now, when it comes to the argument of like, you don't need to stretch, you don't need to do mobility exercises, I think part of that pushback, where there's a lot of this, it's bullshit, it's snake oil, is that everybody's got a different description of what mobility means. You know, like the way that we look at mobility and flexibility and functional range conditioning, flexibility is essentially the tissue's ability to be able to be put at length with external load. I mean, that could be like if I'm doing a hamstring stretch and I just bend over with my body weight pulling, how far can I bend over and touch my toe? That's passive flexibility, meaning that I need some external force to get me there. Well, say I have really tight hamstrings and I can't touch my toes. If I want to be able to load my hamstring at a greater length than what I can just passively get to, the only way that I can get further is to just passively stretch. I need to do some passive stretching to be able to get there, because that's how we can get into that new position to be able to load that tissue. What we're calling mobility is how much active range do you have? So for example, like me bending over and trying to pull me down and touch my toes, that's passive. But if I were standing and holding my leg up straight in hip flexion, that would be more of an expression of active hip flexion. How much can I contract that stuff in the front of my hip and pull that hamstring into length? And all of those are important components of movement, but really the main thing is that in my passive range, that's all I can do is be passive there. That tissue is not good at generating force. In my active range, that's the limit of how much that tissue can work. And, you know, if I say I have a lot of passive range, but I don't have very much active range, all that means is that I can get into positions easily where that tissue doesn't really work like I would want it to. It's not really strong there. I can close that gap by training those ranges. Somehow I can use, you know, we start with isometrics because that's a lot of time under tension. It's relatively safe loading as opposed to just doing exercises. But using, like, talking about hamstrings and using the example of the RDL, you know, people are like, you do RDLs because you are getting a stretch in the hamstrings and you're training it to length, which is true. You are training it to some length, but that component that I mentioned before of the bell curve of, as my hamstring gets longer and longer, I start to lose my ability to generate and absorb force. And at some point, I'm going to get to a point where I really can't do a lot of work. So unloaded, say it's here. This is my long and short range of my usable hamstring range of motion. As soon as I add load to that, well, those little end ranges of that, I'm not going to be able to absorb or generate enough force to do work there. So now when I load that up, my range is more like this. It's kind of the example of like people who have shoulder flexion at a certain point, and then they go into a handstand, and all of a sudden their overhead position, I'm going to turn sideways here, all of a sudden their overhead position looks more like this, because unloaded, they can get their shoulder to here, loaded or pressing dumbbells overhead, there's just not enough force that you can generate in that end range, so we go into this position. So that's one problem why just training using an exercise only may not be enough to get you more length over time. Now, there's certain ways you could do it. Like if every time you did RDLs, you were really focusing on going into that end range, hanging out in that end range, letting the weight pull you down, you probably could get length. It's not like, I'm very unbiased in the methods of how you do this because it all just comes down to loading. But very simply said, like if you can't get that tissue in that position, passive stretching is the first step to do that. And then loading it somehow in that new range is how you want to do that. And often when you get in that new range, you just don't have a lot of capacity there. So loading it at something that's a low level of loading that you can actually stay there and do work is the key. And that's really what makes the difference here is like, we know that to get stronger at bench press, you got to do some bench press. If you want to get more hip internal rotation and be stronger in hip internal rotation, or you want to get stronger in that end range of spine flexion, you just need to spend time loading that tissue in that position. And there's lots of ways to do that, but isometrics, passive stretching is a really good entry point because you can really control how much loading you're using. You can be really specific as far as, you know, getting that tissue to stretch and then loading it, versus if I'm just doing Jefferson curls, I may not be spending enough load on that particular area of tissue that just doesn't move, so the progress may not be as fast. I'm not saying that people don't get more mobile doing Jefferson curls. They do, but sometimes you can, you know, increase load and movement in an area of your spine that already moves better, and you're not getting it to move more in that lumbar stuff that you really want to move. So that's one component where I think, again, like like all of these details that I'm getting, it's definitely nuanced. Like our bodies are complicated. And so it always depends on what's going on. But going back to what I was saying before about training different kinds of tissue, like if I'm doing bicep curls, I'm training my muscular tissue, but there's ways where we can target connective tissue more specifically, like certain types of movement. Passive stretching actually targets connective tissue and can build connective tissue architecture. So can isometrics, so can eccentric contractions as well. So there's ways, like a good example of dealing with connective tissue, I'm sure you felt this somewhere. Say you're stretching your hamstrings, and a lot of people have felt this before. You're going into a hamstring stretch and you're gradually increasing your hip flexion and you feel like you have a nice global hamstring stretch. And then all of a sudden you get to a little further in that stretch and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, I feel that like right behind my knee. I feel this really acute spot of stretching. A lot of the time we feel that when we're doing passive stretching. That's the feeling of having connective tissue architecture that doesn't respond to loading the way that the rest of that stuff does. So part of this thing with connective tissue is that as I'm adding a little bit of load to the connective tissue, the strain on the tissue is going up by the same amount. It's like a 1-to-1 ratio. So it goes up, nice like 45-degree angle of increasing strain as I add load. And if you have connective tissue that doesn't tolerate loading as well, you'll add that same amount of load to it, but the strain goes up by a lot. And that's usually what it feels like when you find those spots. You're like hamstring stretch, and now it feels like the hamstring behind my knee is going to explode because there's so much more tension there. When you have that, like when we're doing exercises in general, we're kind of making an assumption that my connective tissue can tolerate this amount of loading. And if you're getting into those angles where that connective tissue doesn't tolerate load like the rest of all those fibers of muscle that you're trying to train, it's easy to overload that stuff. And doing more reps of the exercise doesn't resolve that. So that's another component like that I just totally abandoned. I was like, I don't need to passively stretch. I'll just do deep squats. I'll do like RDLs and go deep. And my hamstrings are really tight. And it turns out when I went to go kind of explore all these little details, I had lots of spots where I was like, holy shit, like my left hamstring, when I stretch it the same way as my right, my left knee feels like it's going to explode in the back. It feels like my hamstring is going to tear back there. And I just had bad connective tissue architecture relative to all the other stuff around there. And I resolved it by just doing some passive stretching. I think where a lot of this stuff comes up is that, simple answers are nice. It's nice to just know, like, don't worry about passive stretching, just lift weights, you'll be fine, because that seems to be more accessible. When the approach is like, well, you probably do need to do some passive stretching. You should lift some weights. You should make sure that your joints work like they're supposed to. And if they don't, let's fix that. It's like, fuck, I have all these things that I have to worry about now. And it seems like it can be overwhelming. So I think a lot of that just gets pushed because I like simple answers. It's like, yeah, I would love to not have to stretch. If I could just deadlift 7 days a week, like how awesome would that be? I would just do that forever. I wouldn't worry about anything else. I'd just deadlift heavy and like life is good, man.
Yeah, and it's obvious that stretching works because you don't just do the splits, right? I'm sure there was a point where you did not have the range of motion you have now. Obviously,
not even close. I mean, I'm not mobile by lots of mobile standards, but I'm a hell of a lot more mobile than I've ever been.
Yeah, and you talk about taking a tissue doing a full range, getting strong in different ranges of motion, but you're not going to be able to get strong in your full range of motion if you can't even get into that full range of motion. So
totally. So that would be my argument. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Like even like the knees over toes guy stuff, when he does like that really intense, like the knee goes way over the toe, and he, like, some people can't even get into that because their hip flexors are too tight or whatever,
Totally.
And stretching also feels good.
It does. I mean, it does. I think it's a skill. Like, you got to get used to doing it. Like when I first started stretching, I mean, I was really tight. I never stretched, so it was really uncomfortable. And there's a sweet spot with stretching. Like you can overdo passive stretching, just like you can overdo.
You can hurt I've hurt myself stretching. Like I've gotten like maybe not hurt myself, but like I've experienced like DOMs from stretching.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how legit the study was. Just a side note, I read this study that was done in the last few months, and they were looking at like very minimal hypertrophy gains from passive stretching.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, but like you can totally cause muscle damage from passively stretching.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, there's like the the neurological component of that too, like your body, your brain is trying to be aware of where everything is in space and what it's doing. And if you're looking at passive stretching, if you get into a stretch that's so deep and so intense that your brain perceives that as risky, it can actually neurologically tighten up the tissue more and kind of like push you out of the stretch, because it's saying like, this seems like a bad idea. I better tighten this tissue up more to be protective of it. And if you're always bumping into that when you're passively stretching, that alone can be really hard to make progress, you know? So it's like when you're passively stretching, it should feel mildly uncomfortable, but if you're there for 2 minutes passively stretching, you should feel the stretching sensation diminish a little bit. If it's not diminishing, if it's getting more intense, if you're like sweating, you're probably just stretching further than you need to.
Mm-hmm.
It's always my rule for people passively stretching.
Yeah. So like as far as like programming passive stretching into your training week, is there really a risk to I remember like back in the day, people were like, oh, don't ever stretch when you're cold and stuff like that. Is that bullshit?
Again, I think there's some nuance involved with it. Like, you know, I'll tell you how I incorporate passive stretching and how I do it with all of the people that I train and all of the clients that I write programming for. But I'll tell you my feeling on that. Like, yes, I would say if you did a really high intensity hamstring stretch and you say you stretch your hamstrings for 5 minutes and then immediately you get out of that passive stretch and you do a dead ass sprint as hard as you can, potentially that might be too much. Again, it just depends. Like, have you not been stretching a lot? Somebody who's done a lot of passive stretching and has good range of motion may be totally fine, but somebody who hasn't done a lot of passive stretching, or they go passive stretch their hamstrings for 5 minutes and they go try to pull their 1 rep max dead, not like anybody really would do that. I would say that wouldn't be my best approach for doing it. Yeah, maybe you could increase your chances of injury, but you know, passively stretching before you work out, depending on what you're doing leading up to your heavy lifting, if that's what you're going to do, was something that I completely avoided because I read the same stuff. Like, if I stretch, I'm going to become weaker, I'm going to injure myself, I don't need to passively stretch. When I train now, I do a shitload of passive stretching before I get to the lifting component, but I'm not only doing passive stretching. Like in function range conditioning, I was talking about, we passive stretch, we do isometrics as part of it in the beginning. You know, I might do hip internal rotation stretch if that's what I'm trying to improve. And after I spend a couple minutes there and I'm in a little bit more range of motion than I do, we call them pails and rails. It's progressive and regressive angular isometric loading. It really just means you're isometrically contracting in pails this tissue that's stretched, and you're trying to, you know, if I'm trying to get more joint space, I'm going to try to do those isometrics up to my maximal effort. And then rails is basically contracting the shortened tissue on the other side of the joint, say the stuff that would pull my hip into more internal rotation. So after I passively stretch, I do these really hard isometrics. And then after that, I follow up with like a hip car. So I'm moving my hip through that new range of motion to make sure my brain knows how to use that tissue. And then I go and do fundamental joint movement, like I'm doing some fundamental hip rotation stuff. I'm training that range of motion. Maybe I have ankle weights on, I'm doing some kind of rotational based movement. Then I do more hip cars. And then I go deadlift or squat or something like that. So I did passively stretch, but I used a bunch of isometrics. I used a bunch of different movement components. So I've really used that range of motion to the point where I'm not just going into that heavy lift having just freshly passive stretch. There's been a lot of active movement that requires nervous system control of that tissue. And really what you get out of that is I'm in a little bit better, potentially if I need it, like say I need more hip rotation. Now I have a little bit more room for my joint to move. I can get into a better position. The other thing about that is that if I have, since again, going back to the hip, my hip's ability to rotate, that allows my hip to get into a better position, which allows me to recruit more tissue. So I always use these analogies for, or not an analogy, but just as an example for people who are interested in bodybuilding. Like if you're training for hypertrophy, your goal is to recruit as much muscle tissue as possible. If I can get my joint into a position that allows me to recruit more muscle tissue, that just means I have more potential for more hypertrophy, because I'm recruiting more muscle tissue than I would be if I had limited range of motion because my joint just didn't move there.
That's a good point.
And so, you know, part of this has been like, I mean, I just say it like, this method, in my opinion, is really doing the stuff that we all really want. Like if you want to train to get bigger muscles, but you also don't want to just get giant muscles and feel like shit, this allows you to do both of those things. Like make your shoulder joint work better, get yourself in an environment now where there's going to be more tissue that you can recruit. You'll make more progress. You get bigger muscles. You know, it's like, we all want that.
Yeah, for me, it's like bodybuilding isn't just about building a bigger body. It's about building a more resilient body as well.
Yeah.
You know, it's a good way to look at it. That's how I look at it. Like I'm doing this to, you know, people like to throw out the term bulletproof, but like, yeah, I want to bulletproof my body as much as possible.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, you know, like, yeah, that's a buzzword, right? Like bulletproof your spine. I mean, life is crazy. Shit happens that's going to be well outside of our control.
If someone shoots you in the spine, I don't think any amount of anything is going to help you.
Definitely not. There's definitely scenarios where I get hit by a car. That's probably not going to do me that much good. But, you know, like what we talk a lot about in the functional range conditioning world is injury mitigation. And that sounds kind of like, I don't know if it sounds a little snooty or whatever, injury mitigation, but I like that term, right? Like if I get my spine to have more flexion where it once didn't, and then I make that new range of flexion really fucking strong, my back is going to be far more tolerant of getting loaded in that end range, which just means that might mitigate the level of injury that happens if I don't, who knows what happens. I fall skateboarding and I twist really hard when I land or something like that. I mean, you can definitely improve the capacities of your body. Like I for a lot of people who've had, anybody out there who's had like a shoulder subluxation or a shoulder dislocation, I mean, the most common way that people dislocate their shoulder is an external rotation. So if I fall down and I put my arm out and there's more force applied pushing my arm back in external rotation than what that tissue can resist, I will damage the tissue. I can subluxate or dislocate my shoulder. If I trained my external rotation and I had a ton of range of motion there for at least enough for all the activities that I want to do, and I make that range really, really strong, if I fall and hit the ground in that position, that tissue is going to be way better prepared to deal with that level of force. And that could be the difference between I just tweaked my shoulder a little bit instead of dislocating it. Or for people out there who do things like jujitsu, I mean, if you're getting put in an Americana and somebody's trying to submit you by pulling your shoulder into external rotation, if you don't have a lot of capacity there, it's going to be really easy to submit you in that position. However, if your shoulder's really, really strong in external rotation, you can resist a lot more force. That can be the difference between tapping and not tapping. You can allow you to get out of that position. I mean, outside of just general strength training, there's a lot of applications for this stuff, but you know, I don't do jujitsu. I have clients that do, and they all say it's like, this is like a cheat code using this stuff because it really does enhance your ability enhances your movement options, enhances your control and your strength through all those ranges. I live in the strength training world. I like feats of strength and stuff like that. But, you know, I always just, even looking at something like a squat, like even if I have a hip and a knee that feel okay, if I train those end ranges of where those joints can move and I make those stronger, not in the sense of looking at a squat or anything else, I just can develop more force through more range of motion. You can add numbers to your squat without doing any more volume of squats than what you're already doing, just by that component, which I think is something that's one of the arguments for me that really makes this stuff compelling. When you hear those things about like, you don't need to do mobility work, just keep squatting, because at some point, the longer you train, you're going to run into limitations. Like, you've gotten your squat so strong, what's holding you back? Is it because you need to squat more, or are you being held back by maybe your hip doesn't have quite enough range of motion, or it could do better with more range of motion? Like if you were to watch me squat 10 years ago, I never had a super beautiful squat by any means, but it was like, yeah, squat looks pretty good. I think you're fine. I mean, 10 years ago, I squatted like 410. That was over double body weight. I was like, wow, my squat's really strong. Sometimes I'd squat and throw my back out. When I started working on all of this, I was squatting a lot. I was doing Olympic weightlifting. I was doing CrossFit. I mean, many days a week I was doing squats, and I was able to hit this number. Well, when my back got really bad, I had to quit squatting. I quit deadlifting. I started doing functional range conditioning stuff. I just backed way off on all the things that were hurting me. And I started training my hip, my knees, all of the things that I realized didn't move a lot. And as those got better, I started to get back to squatting a little bit, but I was like you said, I was really afraid because I'd had so many bad experiences with it, like having my wife have to put my pants on me for 2 weeks straight because I tied my shoe the wrong way. I was like, I'm afraid of everything now. This sucks.
Yeah.
And you know, when I finally got to the point where I felt like I could start loading the squats up again, I was like, I'm just going to do an experiment. I'm going to keep doing all of my joint specific work. I'm going to start squatting, but I'm only going to squat 1 day a week, and I'm only going to do 2 sets of squats, and I'm going to see how much progress I can make. And what I was doing was like, I do a couple sets of like Anderson isometric squats, like 10 seconds of isometrics, and I do 1 set of Anderson squats. And I weighed like 190 pounds at the time. I did that for 8 weeks, 1 day a week of squatting. And I hit a 415 back squat, like barefoot, no belt, no knee wraps, which is all the shit that I had on before. And I was like, man, that's crazy. Like I just hit a lifetime PR on my squat. I haven't squatted for a long time. And lately I've only squatted 1 day a week for 8 weeks after not squatting for, 3 years, basically anything heavy. And I was like, man, that's crazy. It makes sense. But I just, it was hard to buy into that because you're just used to, if I want to squat heavy, I got to squat 4 or 5 days a week. So really where my limitations were my hip joint was doing everything that it could, and that was the thing that was preventing me from getting any stronger. Like I just didn't have enough hip rotation. My hip was maxed out. So by getting more capacity in my hip joint, my spine, my ankles, all those parts improved, I could get into a better position. I could recruit more muscle tissue, and I could get a bigger squat.
And what I really like about your message and your content is you're not just some like dorky mobility guy that doesn't actually do any of the shit. You know what I'm saying? Like,
totally.
Like you have receipts, you have videos of you with these like crazy strength feats. So you're not just some guy like sitting there with a fucking band.
Yeah.
That's the shit that gets a bad rep. And not from like whatever, like people don't have to lift heavy if they don't want to, but it's just like seeing you do those super heavy lifts, these like weird Zercher these deadlifts and stuff like that. It's like, holy shit, man. Like clearly whatever this guy's doing is working. And hearing that story about like you're working on your hip and then getting even stronger getting to the same level without having to use like knee wraps and a belt and shit like that.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy. That's pretty crazy.
Thanks, man. Yeah, it was definitely eye-opening for sure.
One thing that has kind of gotten a bad rep lately is like the functional training world, and you use that term like functional.
Oh man,
that's like I'll call Joel Seedman out, but you go for it. you go on his Instagram and it's just like, what the fuck is this nonsense, right? And that's the thing. Like obviously, like that's a straw man of like anybody can meme whatever they want to in the fitness world. But yeah, functional training kind of has gotten a bad rap over the last little while. And I get why to a certain extent, but then there are certain things where I think about, like for what function are you trying to accomplish? And one thing in particular is just like in bodybuilding and powerlifting, everything is very, everything's just kind of linear. You're not doing a lot of rotation work. If one day you have to like twist your spine to lift, which is super common in day-to-day life.
Sure.
So maybe, that's one argument from functional training is like, you can't always lift something with a neutral spine. And that's why like, it's so ridiculous that everything is like, you're going to hurt yourself if you don't lift with a neutral spine. Well, it's like, you never do that in real life. Like you will never not round your back in real life,
absolutely.
or twist your back or rotate your back. So like, that's one thing why, quote unquote, functional training, that's one thing that's an argument that could be made to support it. It's like, well, look, maybe let's just get into that. Cause like, what do you think about the demonization of functional training? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I get why it's been demonized, because I see that word and I see things that get posted and you're like, look at this functional movement. This is the most functional thing that you can do. And like, depending on what page you're looking at, you're like, what the fuck is functional about that? Like you got bands around you, you're like jumping and twisting. And there's definitely needs to be more context with the word functional. And in reality, you could say that certain things are more or less functional for sure, but like functional range conditioning has the word functional, and I'm pretty sure that just that alone, people see that and they're like, oh, it's bullshit. Functional training is a joke. There's nothing that's functional. Although when I think about that, I'm like, what is the definition of functional? To me, the definition of functional is like, you have a shoulder that does all of the stuff that a human shoulder has evolved to do, or a spine has evolved to do, and it's really fucking strong in all of those positions you can put in. Like to me, that's about as functional as it gets. And so, when I see these things that are functional, there's lots of movements that you see that are called functional that could have applications for all kinds of stuff that are good. But again, it comes back to like, do you have a spine though that moves like a spine? Because if you don't, loading the shit out of the rotation of your spine maybe isn't the best place to start doing that so-called functional movement. I mean, when people are like Turkish get-ups are functional, kind of like, it's good to be able to get your ass off the ground. But do you need to be able to do a Turkish get-up with your body weight though? I don't know if that's functional or not. It really just depends. I mean, are you somebody who, I don't know, law enforcement people get into physical altercations, they get pushed on the ground, they have somebody holding them down. Yeah, in that case, if you're trying to push somebody away from you while you're getting up off the ground, having more strength in that position could be really functional. I look at somebody like my mom who's 73 and we train 3 days a week. I don't have her do any Turkish get-ups because she doesn't have knees or wrists that are able to tolerate that. We do things that are more functional for what her needs are. So I think that's where the context comes in, is like, what's functional for your physical needs in your life? And, you know, training to improve those and maybe give you a little buffer zone outside of that, that's functional. But yeah, I think that term's been bastardized. I mean, Joel Seedman, like, clearly he's doing a great job marketing his stuff. He's successful. You can't hate on that. I don't agree with that shit being functional or that it's the optimal thing to do. I mean, you know, like, going back to let's talk about the spine. You know, like, I have a lot of people who will message me or just literally send me like direct quotations from Stuart McGill about like,
Yeah.
whatever, you know, you flex your spine, it degrades your discs to the point where they're non-existent, you know, like
dead pig spines.
on dead pig spines. Totally. It's like, oh yeah, dead biology works just like living biology, of course.
Yeah.
Outside of that,
dead biology can adapt, apparently.
Yeah, I mean,
dead biology can't adapt. Who knew?
Totally. I know. It's so fucking silly. But like, I do understand where that's come from to some degree, because how many people out there have hurt their backs flexing them and loading them in flexion, or twisting and loading them? Like, everybody. I hurt my back more times than I can count doing that. How many people have hurt their knees because they went over their toes? They loaded through the ball of their foot. I mean, I think that stuff happens because, yes, that's where people get hurt all the time. But in reality, it's just a function of getting into positions where the tissue isn't prepared to do the work. I mean, that's something that is I'm stealing this from functional range conditioning, is like, there's no good or bad movements as far as more or less risky. There's just prepared or unprepared tissue.
Yeah.
And if tissue's unprepared, bad shit happens. If it's prepared, you can do unbelievably crazy stuff. I mean, you look at all the physical things out there that people do and they do for a really long time. Like, the body is adaptable to damn near whatever you want to do with it. You just need to adapt it. And most of the time what we're doing is stuff that we're not really well prepared or adapted to do. You know, like, everybody can bench press, but if you have a really shitty shoulder that doesn't have much rotation and isn't very strong in those positions, bench press can really destroy your shoulders. Where for somebody else who has good range of motion in their shoulders, bench pressing is awesome. They make PRs and just feel great. That's really the distinction. So, you know, when I really, coming back to that, like, I really feel like functional is you have a functioning body part that does what it was evolved to do. You have a spine that is nice and flexible. It bends, it extends. You can control that. That's functional as shit. Now go do whatever you want.
Yeah, 100%. No, I totally agree with that. And that's, yeah, it's just one of those things in the fitness industry. It can get divisive, and people, I don't know, they like to straw man things. It's even like CrossFit has been pretty demonized. And I get why, to a certain extent. There's certain aspects of CrossFit that could be negative, I guess, but like, it's like everything, like, you can do it. There's different ways to do it. And you can't just like,
there is, totally. I mean, I'm a 100% totally burnt out CrossFitter. I'll never do CrossFit again. I have no desire to do it, but yeah. I think there's some really great components about it. Like the community side of it, like, you really bond with these people that you're suffering with. Like, there's some really cool stuff there. It's just a lot of the time, like, somebody who's just starting to work out, who hasn't done, you know, like, basic whatever shit. They've never trained their shoulders. Like, they don't need to go swing on a pull-up bar with all of their body weight and try to do kipping pull-ups. And depending on what gym you go to, there's different approaches. There's ways that people build up to that. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it just comes down to, like, CrossFit has a bad name. People get hurt because CrossFit is fucking demanding on all kinds of stuff. Like, there's not much that you could go do, maybe outside of jiu-jitsu, that has that many different varied demands on so many different body parts.
Yeah.
And the volume's high, it's intense. Like all of that stuff is something that takes a lot of progression to get to be able to tolerate. And most people just are jumping into it before they're prepared to do it. So everybody's like, CrossFit fucks your shoulders up. It's like, well, if you have a bad shoulder, yeah, overhead squats are for sure not a good idea. You could train your shoulders to be good at overhead squats. You just need to spend time training them to do that instead of just doing overhead squats, right? That's not, if you don't want to do an overhead squat and you have a shoulder that doesn't move enough to get you there, doing more overhead squats probably isn't the best way to get you to do overhead squats. You can be a little bit more specific and target that. I mean, and you know, like, again, something that I deal with often in my tiny little reality of social media is, you know, I get people all the time who are like, bro, why are you doing that with your knees? What a fucking waste of time. Just go squat more. And, you know, it's tough because sexy stuff sells. I want to see some jacked dude deadlifting 600 pounds. That's cool. That gets me motivated. Seeing some jacked dude sitting on the floor trying to stretch his spine and flexion and do some isometrics, doing nothing, you know, like that's not sexy. That doesn't really look appealing. And I think that's another hard part, is that to do the work that really makes you able to do the sexy stuff in a way that's sustainable,
it doesn't
sexy. Look cool. It's not sexy. It just, the results can be sexy, but it's not appealing. I mean, it's tough, you know, it's like,
that's a good metaphor. That's a good metaphor for life.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. You got to do a lot of unsexy shit to do the sexy shit, you know?
Yeah, totally. It's tough. I mean, I get it. Like I would much rather, you know, I get it. Like kettlebell swings, kipping pull-ups, all this ripped people, sweaty working out, like that shit sells. Doing, you know, segmented cat cow is possibly not as sexy looking, but it's
fair enough.
Your back. Yeah.
How do you what do you do to kind of like manage your social media use? Do you feel yourself getting burnt out doing that kind of stuff?
Oh, yes. It's I mean, I'm really grateful in the sense of it's let me meet people that I would never meet or know they exist. Like I get to meet you, really great and fun to talk to somebody who has similar interests that I don't know. Like those things are awesome, but man, it's so fucking soul sucking. I mean, it's hard because, you know, if you take time to make posts, you want it to go out there and be seen by people, but there's all of the strategy involved, and I really don't have it figured out at all. Like some posts do awesome, other posts I'm like, this is going to be a great one. It's terrible. It's a wild world that I really don't understand, and definitely it crushes my soul often. You know, the little glimmers of optimism that I get from things like this, or meeting new people, getting new clients who are into like-minded training and stuff, that part's wonderful. But I think there's just a lot. I mean, you know, there's so much hatred out there. There's so much, everything's black and white. There's no room for nuance. It's like, you round your back, I fucking hate you. You're spreading misinformation, or I mean, you know, it's just like, I don't know. Everybody's so opinionated about stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah, the internet's pretty fucked up. It's made me even think about it. Like I'm having fun doing this podcast, and I'm kind of thinking like maybe I should just delete my Instagram and just focus on YouTube or something. And because it's like I don't get much out of Instagram. Like even I'm like you, like I'll post certain things, I'll get like 600 likes, and I'll post one thing, I'll get like 6 likes, and I'm like, Instagram's kind of weird. And if you're trying to like, you know, you've built a business, obviously, like you own your own gym, correct?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, now we've moved to New York, and the gym I'm sitting in the gym. It's my little 700 square foot basement, but it has, you know, it's lots of stuff. I train people here. Most of my business is training people over the phone, but we do have clients that come to the house and train.
Yeah. So this is your world. This is your career.
Yeah.
And social media is obviously an extension of that, probably a necessary evil, I would say.
It is. I mean, so prior to this, we owned a gym in California. We co-owned with somebody else out there. It was a 7,000 square foot facility. We had classes. We did personal training. I mean, it was a larger operation. And so transitioning to this side now, moving to New York and doing this out of our house, I mean, it was definitely nerve-wracking going into it, because I mean, in my mind, I'm like, I got this little I had like 1,200 followers or 2,000 followers on Instagram. And I'm like, I don't know, how am I going to get people to come to my house and work out? Like, come to my basement. I'm not going to kill you down here. I promise. I'm not a weirdo. You know, that was hard. I took for granted how nice it is just to have this building with a sign on it. People show up and they come in, and that's like your advertising. So it's been interesting trying to figure out how to do that from the internet side. And I don't, you know, I'm not good at it. I don't really know what I'm doing. I mean, I've just put in time, like trying to post a couple times a day. My Instagram account's grown a lot from where it was. It's not by any means a big account, but I really keep doing it though, because I do get business from it. And, you know, despite all of the negative stuff that's out there, I do get, you know, good people that I get to meet and train. So I think right now it's worth the time, but I really do look forward to the days where I can back off and just be like, my Instagram account's done. It's just going to live out there on its own.
Yeah, fair
I don't know
enough.
when that's going to happen, but
Do you feel like one question I wanted to ask you is, do you feel like when you make like what you're passionate about your career, does it kind of affect how your love for it at all? Or
yeah, I mean, you know, it's funny. Like I really do love what I do. And I'm amazed. I'm like, wow, this is crazy. Like I'm working from my basement. I wear gym clothes every day. Like this is my job. It still is a job though. It's still hard. There's times where it's, you know, whatever. It's stressful. I pack too many clients in one day. I mean, there's all those things that will always be hard. But I can say, you know, prior to my previous existence, like in 2009 is when 2009 is when I quit my job. I was a manager at an insurance company. I was a manager for a team of claims adjusters. I was just trying to climb the corporate ladder. And, you know, looking at the difference between those two times in my life, I feel like I'm grateful that I made the right decision to quit and just start doing stuff on my own like this. But still a job. There's still stress and, you know, days where I'm like, fuck, I don't want to train anybody today. You know, I mean, it's just how it goes. But I'm sure most days I do feel good.
I'm sure you would have felt like that at the insurance place as well.
I was feeling like that every day, all day for a while, which is why I finally threw in the towel and, you know, cashed in my 401k and moved into my parents' basement so I could go coach classes at a CrossFit gym. I mean, the one thing that really does give me a lot of motivation and make me really happy though is really being able to help people fix problems, you know, I mean, and really doing all this functional range conditioning stuff has been the catalyst for really making that a possibility, because prior to all that stuff, a lot of my training other people was sort of just, let's navigate around all of these things that are problematic. And so we'll just avoid spine flexion, we'll avoid deep squatting, we'll avoid pressing overhead, and we can keep you feeling good and working out as long as we avoid all that shit. And this has been a journey towards something that I never would have really expected. Like, what's going on with your shoulder? Let's look at that thing. Let's train that thing. And that's really shifted my perspective on training in general. It's like training should really be improving those qualities that we don't have, the things that we're not good at. Because that's going to really equate to doing way more of the stuff that you really like to do, even if you don't like working on your shoulder internal rotation or your spine flexion. And so that component of being able to really help people resolve their pain, and that's mostly what I do when I train people, is I help them fix back problems and hip problems. I do have clients who are more on the performance side, but that's a much smaller minority. Most of the people that I work with are just like, my back's been killing me for 5 months, for 10 years, for 20 years, whatever that is, and trying to help them resolve that. And being able to help people do that is really, I mean, that's the thing where I'm like, damn, I love this job. You know, it's so nice to be able to do that. And people are like, I started deadlifting again and my back doesn't hurt. Like, that shit really motivates me to keep doing this stuff, for sure.
Yeah, helping others is definitely a path to fulfillment rather than just doing it for yourself, right? Like climbing the corporate ladder. That's kind of where I'm at right now. Is me and my brother own a business that has nothing to do with. It's not really like a passion project, but it's just bringing in money. So,
which is never a bad thing.
Sometimes that needs to be a thing. Like I was actually a music producer. Well, I still produce music a little bit, but I pursued music for a long time, and it just kind of led me into some debt and some bad habits.
Sure. Yeah. Right. They can do that.
And then eventually I just kind of fell out of love with music, or just like the music industry. I'm like, I don't want to make this my career. It's just, I'm not into that anymore. So now I feel like I kind of have like, what would be like almost like PTSD, where it's like, I don't want to just follow my purpose or my passion, because my passion can lead me astray. Sometimes I just need to get the bag, you know, like,
yeah, dude, I totally get that. I mean, I don't know what's right. You know, I mean, it's so hard to figure out. Like, I will say, like, I don't know, maybe if you have an Instagram page and you have 1 million followers and you have all these programs that you're selling and you can make all kinds of crazy money. But I mean, this career is not really glorious, you know, like you're working hours that are very mentally involved. It's tiring, you know, I make more money now than I have in the past, which is awesome. But I mean, I'm probably not going to be a rich person by any means, which is cool. But it's, you know, it's hard sometimes. I mean, that, you know, sometimes I nostalgically think back like, oh, I remember those days at the insurance company where I just got the same check every 2 weeks and I had this retirement and all that shit. And now all that stuff is on me. And I'm, find like, if I want business, I got to put myself out there. I got to do a lot of that stuff. I mean, there's advantages to both. I think if you can find a blend there of something that keeps you happy and you're doing what you want, and if you have to do something you like a little bit less, but it's not crushing your soul and you're making good money, like there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's really good.
Yeah,
but it's hard to navigate that shit.
You got to figure it out for yourself. No one can really give you the answer.
Yeah, totally, man. I don't know. I'm still, I feel like I'm better at it, but I'm still running around in the dark with my hands tied behind my back. I don't know. It's day to day.
It's good to hear that it's not just you.
No, not at all, man. No, for sure.
I guess to wrap this up, one thing I do want to ask is, like, let's say someone's interested in this stuff. Yeah. Into a lot of the movements that you're doing. Like, where can someone kind of get into that? Like, where?
Yeah. So there's lots of options. Like, I'll talk about myself first. I offer personal training, and we remotely and in person. We also have programs. So we have like that internal strength model stuff that I was talking about. We have a monthly program that has something called Kinstretch, which is basically functional range conditioning in a class setting that you follow along with. So they're recorded classes, and it's just joint specific training in a follow along class. There's 4 days a week of internal strength model based strength programming. And then there's days of conditioning workouts. So you can follow a program like that. Or we just have Kinstretch only if you want to do that. But if you're just like, you want to go find somebody who's doing functional range conditioning, you want to go work with somebody, you can go on to the website is functionalanatomyseminars.com. You can type in your address. It will list all of the people who do FRC based training based on your zip code. You can go work with those people. I mean, there's like a manual therapy component where they do manual therapy plus functional range conditioning. There's people that do Kinstretch or do FRC stuff. I always tell people, like, just starting out, start with CARS. The CARS routine is basically you practice just taking each joint through its full range of motion. You do a couple reps every day, call it a daily routine. And that one is a really good introduction to your body parts. Like most people haven't dedicated time to just learning how their shoulder moves, their shoulder blade, their neck, their big toe. And when you do this, you learn how to move each one of those parts by themselves. And it's a really good self-diagnostic. Like, does your shoulder just hurt every time you try to rotate it here? If it does, that's something that you should address. It tells you if you do that, because you may not know that until you reach back here and try to rotate your shoulder. I have a link on my Instagram bio to a CARS routine. It's like 45 minutes of me coaching through each one, but it's free, and it's a really good way to start doing CARS, and at least it's a nice way to dip your toes in the water. And it's something that long term, I tell people, like, I always use this analogy, so I'm just going to use it again. The ship is sailing forward in the ocean, and the ship is basically an expression of how your body moves. And how you move your body dictates where that ship steers. So if we just live our regular lives, I don't maintain my shoulder's ability to move through its full range of motion, the ship is slowly steering towards losing range of motion. And that's something, like I said, we all just associate with aging. When you start doing your CARS routine, you at least are holding that ship on a steady course where it's not losing range of motion, because every single day you're just telling your brain, I need all of this tissue back here. I need all of this spine stuff. And just doing that might take you 8 to 10 minutes a day, but it's enough that you're not going to lose what you currently have. And I think that's a really big thing that we should all consider, is like maintenance. You need to maintain that shit if you don't want to lose it. So CARS routine, start CARS. Everybody who's listening.
Yeah,
highly recommended.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if you had like a cheat sheet or a checklist, but I guess you got that video, so I'll definitely go through that. I might experiment. I'm gonna experiment with this over the next little while and see how it does my body.
Yeah, man. If you want, I have some Kinstretch classes. Like, I'll send you a spine Kinstretch class that you could start with, just to kind of get a feeling of what that stuff feels like. And it would just be some extra spine training that you could do outside of the stuff that you're doing. And it's easy to follow along with, and you don't really need any equipment. So I'm happy to send that to you.
Cool, man. Cool. Well, I definitely want to stay in touch. I'm going to keep following your stuff. If you just want to let people know where they can find you online, that'd be great.
Yeah. The name of our gym is Basis Health and Performance, New York. It's Basis HP NY. I don't know. Let's do this, because I'm going to say the email address wrong because I never give it out. If you go to my Instagram page, my handle is Strange Grayson. It's got a link to our website, all of our programs, all that stuff. You can message me there. And thanks, man. It was great to be on. Really nice to meet you.
Yeah, you as well, buddy. Thanks for coming on.
Totally. It's a pleasure.